Zionism. And people might come and tell me, and I respect other ideologies, they might say that the purpose of Zionism is the existence of maximum Jewish people on maximum parts of the state of Israel. This is a worthy cause, but it is different. For me, the purpose, the goal is Jewish sovereignty within the state. And since this existence is for me the utmost important thing, and the war that we are holding for the mere existence of the state of Israel is not only for its physical existence, but its existence as a national home for the Jewish people. I will need in each and every stately process to make concessions for some parts of the state of Israel, although I believe, like anybody else who's here and who's not here, for our right on each and every part of Israel. I have no dispute over this right. I'm willing to fight for it, but I have to choose according to what is important to me. And in my opinion, this could create common grounds, because unfortunately what is happening while we're arguing amongst ourselves only through the state of Israel, we're losing the content of the state of Israel as a home for the Jewish people. And I entered politics when there was disputes, horrible dispute, between what was perceived as the peace camp and what was perceived as the Greater Israel camp. And there was no dialogue because these were two completely different beliefs. And I think that neither comes on expense of the others. I want to create a process that preserves the state of Israel, that creates a peace process that is being done in the proper manner. I don't believe it was done properly with the Oslo Accords, but this is understood. We understand what is the common goal. We're talking Judaism, we're talking democracy, and since there is differences between the various groups, we're talking about a Jewish country, a democratic country. I'm going to describe what's going to happen in a regular street on Tel Aviv. If you'll just talk to a child who just went out of a state school, elementary school, and he's going to say democratic, he's going to know exactly the theory. I don't know if it's because the teachers taught him that, but because he watches enough American films. If you're going to ask him what is a Jewish state, I'm not certain he can tell you what it is. He can define what it is. He wouldn't know, because the entire Jewish matter is a traditional, not only religious, is fading out, because the connection to the Jewish aspect is not what you're being taught at school, but something that you are connected to emotionally. And if my children, who are now already adults, they're mature, they're young people, but they're mature people, they're the only ones in their class in Tel Aviv who, during the Yom Kippur, it's not because I'm so religious, but on Yom Kippur, on holidays, they're the only ones of their class who come. So this Jewish tune is not going to be there anymore. And part of my obligation, and it's important for me, it's more important for me than it is for the ultra-Orthodox world or some of the Zionist religious world. And I ran many discussions. We were at the funeral of Rabbi Ravitz this week, and we had lengthy, broad discussions in the Knesset. And I think also a year's time ago, he was here in the conference, and he talked to me just following the panel about the contents. And I told him that for me, this is more important, because in Bnei Brak or Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem or religious other settlements, they do by definition preserve, and the youth sees it in the street, at home, and this is something that does not need to be created. But for those who view the Jewish idea a national thing, there is an importance in preserving it through external means. And for me, the Jewish aspect is a national thing, and this is not a monopoly of any kind of political party who might represent the ultra-Orthodox or some other group in the Knesset, because this is hurting the mere thing, because we have a generation growing up that sees the entire Jewish context through politics, and they rebel, and they are anti, and they have fears, and they're afraid that we're going to get up in the morning and see the halacha state, and then there is a political party that is carried by these waves of hate, because they're so it's very easy to have mandates through fears and hate. I don't think that this is the job of leadership. My job is to create the common ground, the common denominator, but we have to put things on the table. This is not an interest of a particular sector. This is an interest for the full country, for the state, for the people. And so I share from the first lesson that I was part of when they were talking about the law of the Shabbat. Just as I thought that not upholding the law of the Hametz is a national mistake, this is not a favor to anybody, for me, for my children. This is a national matter. And I would like to see that even within a very harsh political disagreement, we're going to find this common grounds. And I'm not taking it lightly. I'm not taking the political disagreement lightly. And I understand that for some of the public, making concessions on part of Eretz Israel is impossible, incomprehensible, and we must not get there. This is an argument that we're going to have to hold. But I am afraid that we're losing throughout the ability to discuss things that are important to everyone. And on the eve of the disengagement, and throughout the disengagement, and I'm saying that as somebody who was supportive of this move, and I believe that that way or another, Jewish settlement could not have survived that. Although my heart was torn, and until today, I think that the government did not do enough for all those people who were evacuated, and I intend to do more for them, and I'm keeping in touch with these people. But I've said, let's discuss the contents, the Jewish identity of the State of Israel, and not only deal with a dispute which is political. And I'm saying that when we are on the eve of elections, 2 weeks before that, because I'm quite tired of all those metaphors and images and placing people in their categories and their rubrics, this is how we're going to see this gap growing bigger and bigger in Israel. The second part, when I talk about a Jewish and democratic state, what is the stately meaning? And since the important thing is to preserve sovereignty, Jewish sovereignty and democratic rule, I have to make some concessions on part of the country. But I have to do it in a manner that represents the interest of the State of Israel, in a manner where the output, the final output, is going to preserve the existence of Israel as a home for the Jewish people. And the solution is not only 2 states, but 2 national states. And so in everywhere, when they talk about 2 states, I add 2 nation states for 2 people. And what seems to us something that we don't accept in the world, they already left this issue of national state because it's something that is clear. There's a process of delegitimization of Israel as a national home. It's unclear what is this issue. And I'm talking about this as a Minister of Foreign Affairs in each and every gathering in Europe. My struggle is to include the national bit, despite the fact that 2 states, or the word 2, is not acceptable for many. But I'm telling you that if we're not going to promote this process in our way, other things are going to happen, and time is not in our advantage if I want to promote the interest of the State of Israel. But the principle of 2 national states means that refugees are not in Israel, and the only way to convince and to have world support is only if we say 2 national states, yes, providing that refugees are not in Israel, because Israel is a state, is the home for the Jewish people, providing that they're going to live in peace and security. This means that there's going to be overseeing the borders. We're not throwing the key to the other side of the border. We hope for the best, and we want an effective government. And of course, we have to fight terrorism, first of all, and a line of many other things that are not an ideology, but they're simply something that obliges each and every leadership. And when we do it with entities that we might have common grounds with, of course, we're not going to talk to the Hamas, not in order to punish the Hamas, because they're not any entity, any address to discuss anything with, because their ideology is extremist, is Islamic. It only intends to prevent our existence here. This is what we did in the last operation, and if this is not enough, there are going to be more. And I don't have any interest in ending this operation. They're asking me, what about the state procedure state? I'm going to talk about preventing smuggling. That's the thing. Ending the operation is not going to be shaking heads with the knee at the White House, but I can accept the international legitimacy only if I promote throughout a process whereby international perception and the best ally of Israel also perceives it as a true process, and then I can recruit them to things that are important to us. And what is important for us is deciding on the future border, is of course security, maintaining maximum Israeli citizens in their home is given Jerusalem. And here, I'm also very tired of this game of pre-election night. Who cares more about Jerusalem? Jerusalem is not something that should be on the election advertisement. This is a historical issue. It's important for everybody, should be important for everyone. And when I enter the room of negotiation and have to struggle, I know how to bang the table. And I have been a part of the Likud when we started out with this idea. This one is going to give the divide and all of these different things, different advertisements, commercials, instead of putting Jerusalem in the heart of consensus. And this is why I believe that at this point of time, where we are at right now, we can go in all sorts of directions. Israel could be a state that is in a frozen state trying to buy time. The world is laying out all kinds of programs. It refuses some and then some others. And then somebody tries to get to a decision. You shake hands. And then leadership, and I'm so familiar with that. I saw it happening. Prime ministers who say no in the beginning, and then they run for compromise. And I know how to say ahead of time where the compromises are going to be and when the definite no is going to be. And when this happens, when Israel is going to be in the corner, in a frozen situation, it would not be able to recruit the world, not even for 3 weeks of operation of this kind, with all of the casualties and all of the destruction that we see in Gaza. This is truthfully the pictures as they are not distorted. We had to work very strongly, and it's very good that we did it. It could be Israel where the Jewish idea is perceived as something that has to do only with Shas, perhaps, or the Jewish idea could be a matter that is relevant for everybody, no matter if you're secular or religious, just as the issue of Eretz Israel, even if we're talking about a right for Eretz Israel, this can be, or the process in an argument, this can be a matter of everybody. This can be politically approached, and I intend to go to the public with that. I hope for their support. I would be very happy if we could go just a day after the elections for a unity, not in the technical sense of government, and I think that only Kadima can come up with a united government, with Memshelet Achdut, because we can bring about these contents. I'm talking about the unity, the one that we so desperately need, because we have a great army. It knows how to protect the borders. But if we're going to crumble from within in the sense of our values, the best army is not going to assist us there. And with this hopeful tone, because I think that in these elections, this is a choice between despair and hope, I would end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now for the Jerusalem Prize. It was established in 2003. Rabbi Yossi Shuker was the establisher, and they wanted to deal in farming and agriculture. And they have always promoted Jewish labor. Today they employ about 40 Jews. All settlers of the region, and you can see it on the clip that we at Arutz Sheva have prepared for you.
Actually, we're all very, very lucky in order to really learn something about the region, about Islam, with the greatest living authority on Islam in the Near East. Many of you know Professor Bernard Lewis, some of you more, some of you less, but just in the name of getting through formalities as quickly as possible, let me just share with you that Professor Lewis is recognized as perhaps the world's leading authority in Islam today. He's authored some 30 books and hundreds of articles. I even think more than 1,000 articles. I was doing the math today, Bernard. And length, you haven't counted? Just go to Google. If you go to Google, it's kind of like going into Professor Lewis's home. It's amazing. Thousands and thousands of sources written over the last 70 years of professional life, thinking about the tough questions that Islam poses and the Arab world poses to all of us and to itself. And I must tell you that between 1941 and 1945, Professor Lewis served in Her Majesty's Service, British Intelligence Agency's Middle East Desk. From 74 to 76, he was the Cleveland Dodge Professor of Near Eastern Studies in Princeton. And of course, many of you know him for his best-selling books, Crisis of Islam and What Went Wrong, which have been translated into some 20 some odd languages, including Farsi and Indonesian. And I must tell you, just as a personal anecdote, that many Arab leaders and academics whom I've been able to come into contact with in the region are all wait for Professor Lewis to visit the area so that they have a chance to sit with him as well. And so let's get into it quickly because we don't have much time and we have much to learn. It's good that they have two comfortable chairs here, Professor Lewis. I actually asked for a couch that I could lie down on because the region's so crazy right now. There's really more questions than answers. I mean, there are some who say that there are no conflicts that can't be solved, and there are others that don't have answers. The first question that I have is, or we have perhaps, if I'm speaking on behalf of everyone here, is what is going on in this recent conflict, latest conflict? You had three major Arab powers publicly condemning the Hamas and, in a way, silently expressing some support for Israel. What's going on?
Is this working all right? No. I think what we are seeing is a recurrence of what I think I would call the Sadat gambit. Let me remind you of what happened with Sadat. Sadat didn't make peace with Israel because he was suddenly persuaded of the merits of the Zionist case. It was a quite different reason. What drove Sadat towards peace was the growing awareness on his part and on the part of the Egyptians generally that Egypt was becoming a Soviet colony. I was in Egypt quite frequently in the late 60s and early 70s, and I saw for myself the Soviet presence had become more obvious and to Egyptians more offensive than the British presence had been in the last phase of the British occupation of Egypt, which I can also recall in the earlier part of my long life. He tried to deal with it in other ways through Washington, but Washington responded with the Vance-Gromyko agreement, which was in effect handing Egypt back to the Russians. And he therefore decided that on the worst estimate of Israel's intentions and on the best estimate of Israel's power, Israel was less dangerous than the Soviets. Of course, that was true. That was what led him to make peace. And it has endured since, a peace that is at best cool and sometimes frosty, but it has held. What I think we are seeing now is a similar phenomenon. The danger that they see this time is not the Soviet Union, which has disappeared, but the multiple dangers presented by Iran. And this comes in several forms. One is what you might call the Iranian imperial danger. Iran, unlike most of the countries of this region, is a real nation with a history and a self-awareness going back not just centuries, but millennia. Figures quite prominently in Jewish history, as you may recall. And we have two images of Iran in the Jewish memory, one typified by Haman, the other by Cyrus. Both are visible at the present time, though Haman seems to be dominant. Let me come back from my point. Iran is once again stretching out westward and eastward. Eastward to Afghanistan, Pakistan, westward, which concerns us more particularly, across the Middle East towards the Mediterranean. This comes in several forms. One of them, I just mentioned what you might call the Iranian imperial. The second is the Shiite threat. Now, Islam has been almost since the beginning divided into two major sectarian groups, the Sunnis and the Shia. The Sunnis form the overwhelming majority, and in countries where there are only Sunnis and no Shia, the difference is unimportant, they're hardly aware of it. Where it is important is where Sunni and Shia meet, and particularly in countries where you have Sunni dominance of Shia populations, a situation for which I would borrow a word from Irish history, call it a Sunni ascendancy. The most notable is Iraq. Iraq has had a Shia majority as far back as we can trace the history, and it has remained under the rule of the Sunni minority through ancient times, medieval times, Ottoman times, under the British, under the monarchy, and under the various rules that followed them. Only now, for the first time, there is a Shia majority government in Iraq. And the links with Iran are obviously a matter of deep concern. Going beyond Iraq, there are significant Shia populations in Syria, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere in that region. And now, for the first time in many centuries, they see Shiism as a serious threat, a mortal threat to the Sunni ascendancy which has prevailed in the Middle East since time immemorial. What makes this threat even worse is that it is linked with what one might call the revolutionary aspect of the Iranian regime. The word revolution is much used in the Middle East. It's the only generally accepted title to legitimacy. But most of the regimes which call themselves revolutionary, and which came to power by what they call a revolution, I think could be better described as by the French term coup d'etat, or the German putsch. English history happily provides no equivalent. Thanks. The Iranian Revolution is a genuine revolution, resembling in some ways the French and the Russian revolutions, showing some of the same features. Sorry. The internal struggle between moderates and extremists, the terror, the vast impact on the whole world with which they share common universal discourse. And now I think, following the French model and the Russian model, we might say that the Iranian Revolution is entering what you might call the Napoleonic or the Stalinist phase.
So that means...
Now this obviously represents a mortal threat to the established regimes in the region. A threat far more deadly, far more dangerous, far more profound than anything that Israel could offer, even on the worst estimate of Israel's intentions. And that is why, like Sadat in his day, but for even more compelling reasons this time, they are looking to Israel for help in dealing with what they see as the major threat.
Professor Lewis, if Iran, as you say, is racing for regional supremacy and upending, destabilizing Arab regimes with the same energy that it intends to destroy Israel, what does that mean for places like Gaza and the West Bank? Are they, to what extent are they part of the Iranian plan, or how should we think about the closer battlefields to home?
Yes, I think one might divide them into two groups. On the one hand, you have the groups that are themselves Shia. Shia are an important part of the population of Syria and Lebanon. Hezbollah is a Shiite organization, so their link with Iran and with the Iranian Revolution is clear and obvious. There are no Shia Palestinians. And as I said before, where the distinction doesn't exist, it's not important. That is why it is possible for groups of people in Muslim Africa, which is solidly Sunni, or among the Palestinians who are solidly Sunni, to take up the Iranian cause. And that is why I think we find that Hamas has accepted support from Iran and is rallying to the Iranian cause, because for them, in their historical religious awareness, the Sunni-Shia difference is not that important.
So therefore, on balance, because there's a major debate, Professor Lewis, that has been going on about this conflict, meaning in a narrow sense the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as a part of a subset of the Arab-Israeli conflict, that we're really in an ethno-national conflict, some say, we're in a political conflict, some say, but from what you're saying, to what extent are we really in a religious conflict?
I think in the Muslim perception it's basically a religious conflict. It is to decide who will dominate Islam, whose version of Islam will prevail in the Islamic world. And there is no doubt that the Iranians have plans going far beyond the Middle East, extending eastwards into South and Southeast Asia, westwards into Muslim Africa. And there are signs of that in various places. The impact has been enormous. As I said, it had the same kind of impact as the French and Russian revolutions in their days, with the same kind of response. There is one other point, which I think I will mention if you would allow me, and that is what I would call the apocalyptic aspect. In Islam, as in Judaism, as in Christianity, there is a scenario for the end of time, when the final battle takes place between the forces of good and the forces of evil, which for Christians, Jews and Muslims alike means between us and them, the us being differently defined, the them being more or less the same. In the Muslim view, no, let me correct that. In the view of a certain section within the Iranian leadership, it's not by any means unanimous, that time is now. For a group called the Hojatiyah, whose main leader is Ahmadinejad, the apocalyptic time has come. The Mahdi, the Muslim Messiah, is already here. The final battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil has already begun. That is extremely important for another, not immediately related reason. That is the question of Iran's nuclear weapon. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons right through the Cold War, but neither side used them because both sides were aware that if either one did, the other would do the same, and this would lead to mutual destruction. MAD, as it was known at the time, mutual assured destruction, was the main deterrent preventing the use of nuclear weapons by the Soviets. For most of the Iranian leadership, MAD would work as a deterrent. But for Ahmadinejad and his group, with their apocalyptic mindset, mutual assured destruction is not a deterrent, it's an inducement. They believe that the end of time has come, the final battles are already beginning, and the sooner the better, so that the good can go to enjoy the delights of paradise, in the divine brothel in the sky, and the wicked, and that means all of us here, can go to eternal damnation.
On this point of Iranian ascendancy and dedication to the end of days, you have written, especially since 1976, when you wrote The Return of Islam, exactly 2 years before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, first Islamic Revolution in Iran. Many in the West of your colleagues have not seen it the way you've seen it. They have.
Not immediately.
You've expressed concern in your writings, from the return of Islam to the roots of Muslim rage, even to other more recent articles, that the West is not getting something about Islam. What are they missing?
It is normal for human beings to judge others by ourselves. We are now in the 21st century of the Christian era. They are in the early 15th century of the Muslim era. It's a different religion, based on entirely different historical experience, different message, different teaching. And it is therefore a grave error to do what people normally do, and that is judge others by ourselves. It doesn't work, and it's dangerously misleading. If one looks at Islam from within, for that it's necessary to learn at least one Muslim language, something which many Middle East experts, in fact most Middle East experts in the West, for one reason or another, are reluctant to do. If one learns the languages and reads what they say among themselves, and understands it in the context of their own history, their own culture, their own background, then I think it's not too difficult to understand what is happening.
Then why is it, if Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, the Palestinian Authority, and the West Bank are publicly condemning Iran and their servants, their Sunni and Shiite servants, shall we call them, or proxies or surrogates, why is the Arab establishment unwilling to fight when they're so frightened of what they perceive as an existential threat to them?
Because the Arab establishment, as you call it, consists mainly of rather unpopular autocracies. I mean, looking at it from a Western point of view, if you look around the Middle East, you could divide the countries into two groups. Countries with pro-Western, let's be more specific, countries with pro-American governments and therefore anti-American populations, and countries with anti-American governments and therefore pro-American populations. The second consisting essentially of Iran. We and the West are seen as the sponsors, the aiders and the betters of the tyrannies that rule over them. Now, I said a moment or two ago that the regimes now in these countries, the rulers of Egypt and others, see the threat and are therefore turning to Israel. That does not mean that the populations of those countries see it that way or are turning to Israel. Take the specific case of what's been happening in Gaza. Mubarak and his government and his whole ruling apparatus feel mortally threatened by the pro-Iranian presence in the Gaza Strip, and are very happy to see it demolished. But that is not the case with a large part of the Egyptian population. I mean, the Hamas people in Gaza are a part of the Muslim Brothers. The Muslim Brothers constitute a very significant opposition group within Egypt, the Egyptian population. And there too, since the Sunni Shia business is not important, the revolutionary appeal, and even the apocalyptic appeal of Shiism has some impact.
Professor Lewis, what we've seen on the emergence of the communications revolution in Arab countries are a lot of brave attempts, one might call them, to criticize regimes on television,
Yes.
in newspapers, and on the internet. Why is that happening now, and what's the prospect for that type of opposition? Is that Muslim Brother opposition? Is that, can one argue that there are democracy and freedom oppositionaires as well?
Yeah. The communications revolution has had a tremendous impact. In the past, the Muslim world was, on the whole, I would say, rather better situated than the Western world regarding communication, even in the pre-modern era. The annual pilgrimage, which brought Muslims together from all over the Muslim world, gave them a feeling of common identity and common awareness without parallel in the Western world until comparatively modern times. The mosque, the minaret, the preacher gave them a medium of communication free from censorship, and again with a wide impact without parallel in the pre-modern Western world. With the advent of modern communications, all that has changed. Now they have even more than that on a much vaster scale. Radio, television, internet, and the rest of it, now operating on a vast scale all over the Islamic world, including, and this is the part that I find both interesting and encouraging, including Iran. And there is growing evidence that a large part, probably the majority of the population in Iran, are thoroughly fed up with the regime that rules them. This appears in a number of ways, partly through websites, through communication directly by telephone, and in other ways. It's well expressed in what is probably the most reliable indicator of political trends in the Middle East, generally in autocratic regimes, the political joke. Let me give you a couple of examples from Iran. two Iranians are talking, discussing how dreadful the situation is in their country. This is bad, that's worse, this is terrible, that's awful. And but finally one says to the other, what we need in this country is to bring Osama bin Laden here. And the other one turns to him in horror and said, what, are you crazy? And the first one said, no, then the Americans would come. Now that is an authentic Iranian joke, communicated from Iran. It tells you something. Another one, at the time when President Bush launched his attack on Iraq, a lot of people telephoned from Iran to say, you should have tackled your problems in alphabetical order.
By the way, in the first reorganization of the Arab world, you coined a phrase for what happened in Kuwait when Iraq conquered that country. What did you call it?
Really?
Remember? You won't get out of this. Do you remember what you said? What did you say?
I said that the operation should be renamed. Instead of Desert Storm, it should be called Kuwaitus Interruptus.
Now that's a positive note.
Hey, what about Barack Obama? We want to hear about that.
I want to
My specialty is the Middle East, not the Middle West.
But this means something for Israel. What you've said here, and I don't want to let this slip, is that if Israel is being sought after, in a sense, by the Arab world, what does that mean about Israel's own perception of itself in terms of being a regional player as opposed to a bilateral player against the Palestinians, which has been the definition, its own self-definition, very much so until today?
I think Israel needs to redefine itself in accordance with contemporary realities.
Which means?
And that's for Israelis to decide.
How about the longer view, Bernard? You know, let me just mention something. That you've written some 30 books, and for some reason, for some good reason, you've just written a book. It's just sort of hot off the press, if you will, with a dear friend of many, many years and a colleague, Bunsie Ellis Churchill, who is here. Bunsie, just raise your hand so everyone says hello. And this book is called Islam, the Religion and the People. Now, this book comes probably before you've hit your sweet spot in your career, Bernard. You have another 30 or 40 or 50 years, we're sure. But the question is, why the focus on this book now on the religion of Islam, which is where you focused your attention?
Because Islam is very much the topic of the moment. We are dealing with this revolutionary movement in Iran, which defines itself and is indeed defined as an Islamic movement. That's to say, with a challenge to the whole world of Islam. We are in a time when Islam is challenging the Western world in a way that it hasn't done since the early Middle Ages. Remember that in the perception of Muslims at the present day, and of the Western world in earlier times, but no longer today, there has been a cosmic struggle going on for centuries, and indeed for a couple of millennia, between the two world religions, Christianity and Islam. A struggle that has gone backwards and forwards. The Muslims came out of Arabia and invaded and conquered a large part of the Christian world. The Middle East, North Africa, all parts of Christendom then. And then into Europe, southern Italy, Spain, Portugal, a bit of France. But Europe reacted, drove them back. Second attempt, the Ottomans. They conquered Anatolia, which was then a Christian land. Constantinople, which was then a Christian city, invaded the Balkan Peninsula, conquered all of it, and advanced twice as far as Vienna. And again they were driven back. But then, like the Arabs in North Africa, they retained part of their conquests, but lost most of Europe. Many people in the Muslim world see this as, shall we say, third time lucky. The third, and as they hope, the final attempt by the Muslims to bring their holy war into the land of the unbelievers, and after two partly but not finally successful attempts to complete the job. And in that context, they see what is happening in Europe as an essential phase of that. through the double factors of demography and migration. Certainly the progress of Islam in Europe, helped by the willingness of so many Europeans to submit, is making impressive progress.
What you wrote in 1990, a watershed article called The Roots of Muslim Rage. Now, it was just 36 months before the first World Trade Center attack. And the question of the roots of Muslim rage, how do we understand it today? Is it modernity? Is it Christianity? Is it Christendom, as it were? And how should the West respond to that rage?
I think one thing is important to point out, that in the Muslim world, particularly in the Arab world, they have a very strong sense of history, a very strong awareness of history, without parallel in the modern West. Probably you're better situated here. In America, the ignorance of history is quite appalling. If you say that's history, you mean it's finished, over and done with, and of no current importance. And from time to time, as I say, one is appalled at the level of ignorance, even among university students. Now, in the Muslim world generally, they have a very strong sense of history. That doesn't mean to say that their history is necessarily very accurate. That's not the point. But there is this strong awareness. For example, during the 8-year war that was fought between Iraq and Iran, two Muslim countries, both carried on extensive propaganda addressed to their own people and to the enemy populations. And the propaganda from both sides was full of historical allusions. And I mean allusions. They didn't tell stories from history. They would mention a name, a date, a place from 14 centuries ago, in the certain awareness that these references would be picked up and understood. Now, I can't imagine that happening in Europe at the present time. It does happen there. This sense of awareness is very important, and I think it's very much in evidence of the present time. They talk of the first attempt when they made progress and were driven back. They talk of the second attempt when they made progress and were driven back, and now the third. Well, what's the difference now? Each time they were driven back by some new European force. The Byzantines, the European empires. In the modern period, they confronted two rival powers in the world of the unbelievers, which means the world of non-Islam. Osama bin Laden puts it very clearly and very eloquently in his writings that this struggle has been going on for more than 13 centuries. The Islamic world was ruled by successive dynasties of caliphs from successive capitals: Medina, Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, Istanbul. The world of the unbelievers was ruled by successive emperors or equivalent from various capitals. In the final phase, he says, the world of the unbelievers was divided, disputed between two rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. In Afghanistan, he says, we, meaning the Muslims, we defeated and destroyed the more deadly and the more dangerous of the two. Dealing with the Americans will be comparatively simple and comparatively easy. This is the perception which I think motivates the jihadists of the present time. The feeling that this is the final phase of the millennial struggle. They have defeated one of the final two superpowers. They are driving back the other. They are taking over Europe, and the next step is to take over the rest of the world. This outlook is very clearly expressed, and it is linked with the millennial apocalyptic view which I mentioned earlier.
Then let's look at the symmetrical case in the West. The West's experience in the Middle East has not really been all that positive since 1979. In other words, attempts to confront, approach Islam, radical Islam, have not succeeded. Why is that, and what's missing in the analysis of the West?
Well, I think the first thing that's missing in the analysis is an awareness of what we confront. and a more accurate perception of what is happening, of what the different forces are within the Islamic world, I think would be a helpful beginning. The second, I think, is a lack of awareness of the magnitude of the threat. A tendency to see this in old-fashioned terms as some sort of colonial war or some local trouble. It isn't. It's much more than that.
Professor Lewis, let me go back to Iran for a moment and talk about Iranian imperialism and its use of genocidal talk of incitement against Israel in the context of its desire for and its intention to achieve regional supremacy. Can we say, what is the role, let's say, of genocide within Iran's imperial designs? Can it be compared to some sort of Nazi behavior in the past?
Well, genocide is not part of the Muslim scenario for the end of time. Yes, there will be final struggles against Jews and Christians and other non-Muslims, but this kind of genocidal approach, I don't think has precedence in the earlier period. What we do find, certainly, there's no lack of negative or anti-Jewish traditions of the Prophet, and there are various passages in the Quran and traditions which can be cited to that effect. But this is a new one, and I think is obviously connected with the existence of the State of Israel.
And to begin to wind down here, you have given us some reason for worry tonight, some concern. There's concern in the air.
Yes.
Now, having said that, you have been a proponent of some optimistic assessments with some historical precedent about democracy and freedom in the Arab world.
Yes.
Where are we today in terms of the mix of optimism and pessimism of Professor Lewis when it comes to the possibility of democracy and freedom in the Arab world?
Well, I mentioned before what I call the Sadat Gambit. That's to say, of some rulers in the Middle East deciding to make peace and even seeking some sort of relationship with Israel because they fear a greater danger, which led to the peace treaties with Egypt, with Jordan, and to less formal relations with some other Arab states. That is what is happening now. That is which may affect even as improbable a country as Saudi Arabia, which seems to be looking for, shall we say, some measure of understanding. That leads to cold peace, which is better than no peace, but it's uncertain, and one never knows where it will go. The other thing which I see as more hopeful is what I'm tempted to call the Sharansky effect. The spread of the idea of democracy in our own Western form of it to places where previously it would have been inconceivable. It is still small scale, it is limited, and for obvious reasons it is very dangerous to express. But there are signs. We find people like Mithal el-Alusi in Iraq, who suffered a terrible loss. His children were killed because he visited Israel. Nevertheless, he continues to speak of the need for good relations with Israel and holds up Israel as an example of functioning democracy. And there are others too, in other Muslim countries, in other Arab countries besides Iraq. They are not many, and for obvious reasons they don't speak out very often. They'd have to be very careful, but they do exist. I know some of them, I've spoken with some of them, sometimes in their own countries, sometimes when traveling, sometimes by telephone. There are various ways. It's still limited, it's precarious, but it's happening. And that, I think, is probably the best hope for the future, because these people, and there are a number of them, are very appreciative of Israel. I've sat with people watching Israeli television in Arab countries, and they see an Arab member of parliament stand up in parliament, denounce the government, its members, its policies and its actions, and then go home safely. They see this happening in Israel and shown on Israeli television. The impact of this is enormous. This is something beyond their experience, and it really does have an effect. I remember once an Arab boy, who must have been about 12 or 13 years old, had his wrist broken by an Israeli soldier or policeman, and he appeared next day with his wrist bandaged, denouncing Israeli brutality on Israeli television. I was watching this in Jordan. With me was an Iraqi. That was when Saddam Hussein was still in power. An Iraqi who had fled from Iraq to Jordan. And he looked at this in utter bewilderment and said, Wallahi, he said, I would gladly let Saddam Hussein break both my arms and both my legs if he would let me talk like that on television. These people are not stupid, they see it. Another example comes to mind. When Sadat came to Jerusalem and gave his famous speech to the Knesset, he was accompanied by 2 Egyptian guards with him all the time. When Sadat spoke, the Knesset was absolutely silent. You could hear a pin drop. When he finished and Begin spoke, the Knesset reverted to its normal behavior. Telephone calls, cat calls, conversations, interruptions, people coming and going. A friend of mine was standing next to the 2 Egyptian guards who looked at this in utter bewilderment. And one said to the other, I'll give it to you in Egyptian Arabic for those of you who understand. One said to the other, Da'ida, what is this? And the first one said, Demokratia, this is democracy. And the first one said, Wallahi haga hilwa awi, a very sweet thing.
There's nothing else to say after that. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Bernard Lewis. That was wonderful, Bernard. Sensational. Sensational.
Very, very much. Indeed, this was the Afikoman.
כל כך פשוט, יש לך טלפון, אני בבקשה, כל טוב, כל הברכה. אוקיי, להתחרות, שנה הבאה בירושלים.
How do you spell your name, first of all? How do you spell it?
Uriely.
You have a card right here?
I believe I gave the last
Yes, you're out? You're done?
just a minute. By leftist.
Okay, start again. Okay, so your name is Erez?
Erez Uriely. Yes.
How do you spell your last name?
Uriely. You wanted to see how it is written, so please.
Okay. You gotta hold it in front of the camera. I can't zoom in that. I got a good shot here.
And
Uriely.
Yeah. Uriely.
Okay.
If you want to say so, is it okay? Should I come closer?
Oh, come closer. Yeah, there you go. Okay, don't move. Perfect. Hang on. Okay, hang on 1 second.
We can speak about. We can begin from anti-Semitism and what it is, how Jews feel about it, how they, where we can see it, where we can feel it.
What's happening in Europe?
Europe is burning when it's coming to Jews. Jews begin to feel that the soil is burning under their feet, and this is not exaggerated. They begin to fear much more than they did, and they begin to feel not secure about their children, about themselves, and they lose the confidence that they had.
And what's brought about this feeling of insecurity?
When you don't let's say Jews don't feel secure today to go in the streets of Oslo in Norway, but this is not only in Norway, it's all over Europe. In France it is much more severe, and London is beginning to burn as Paris did. But in Oslo we began to feel the first intifada that is really moderate, but next time is expected to be much harsher. I didn't go to an appointment that I had some hours before a demonstration was supposed to begin in the center of Oslo. Simply because I felt that now it's not illegal.
Hang on. Hello? Aaron, is it you? You only? Hey, we're doing a little interview in here, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I thought you called us in.
What's your name?
Erez Urieli.
And what sort of work are you involved in?
I'm the director of the Center Against Anti-Semitism in Norway. We are located in Oslo, and unfortunately there is a growing Jew hatred in Norway, so we have to deal with it.
And is your work focused on anti-Semitism in Norway only?
It's a good question. It was supposed to be concentrated on anti-Semitism in Norway, but unfortunately it is strongly related to anti-Semitism in Israel and also in other countries, of course, because anti-Semitism in Norway is not a phenomenon that is related only to Norway. It's something global. It's because Jews exist, because Judaism exists, and the Jewish state is the center of our time, Jew hatred. So everything is related.
Well, what is the relationship between anti-Israelism and anti-Semitism?
It's part of the same thing. Anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism, Jew hatred, etc. Very much of it you can find modern terminology and different terms that are specific to describe part of it, or some of them are used by mistaken as parallels to what we think we describe, but I think the old Hebrew term of Israel hate, Sinat Israel, is very good, very well describing what we faced.
What do you mean Sinat Israel?
The hatred of the people of Israel, the hatred of the Jew, the hatred of the Israeli, which is the Jew from Jacob from all time. And of course, there is a problem with the state of Israel. Israel is described and treated as the worst country in the world, worse than Iran, worse than Syria, of course.
What role has the media played in people's perception of Israel in such a villainous way?
Whatever people think about Israel, they get it from the media. They don't read books, they don't travel, most of them, and they don't hear it from scientific sources. They don't read articles. They get it from the radio, from television, from newspapers. They see Norwegian leaders of society, parliamentarians, heads of organizations, but all of them are, they come to the people, to the masses, by the media, edited by the media, manipulated by the media.
Okay. What's your name?
Erez Urieli.
And what is your work?
I'm the director of the Center Against Anti-Semitism in Norway.
And how did this center come to be?
Well, it's a weird story. In fact, there was never a plan to establish it, but in the end of 2000, there were very many anti-Semitic expressions in Norway, and my wife and I decided to do some actions. And after a while, the demand from the own Norwegian people that began to call us. They wanted us to arrange more actions. And after a while, this is how the center was evolving.
And where were you born?
In Israel.
And were you raised in Israel?
Yes.
And your wife, where is she born?
She was born in Morocco, on the Atlas mountain. She's a Jewish Berber.
She's a Berber?
Yes. So that's a weird group of minority in Morocco, and you can find them on the Atlas Mountains. And by the way, because of that, she is very much in contact with other minorities in the Middle East, and she developed our contact with minorities as the Berbers, the Copts, the Christian Copts in Egypt, Kurds from Kurdistan, etc.
And what's common about all the groups you just mentioned is that are these groups that have been dominated by Islamic political systems?
Yeah, and still today. And they are suppressed. Many of them, millions of all of these groups were killed, as also Jews in Arabia. Arabia was once a place with many Jews. They didn't exist. Some of them killed, some of them Islamized. And this is what happened to many other minorities, like the Christians in Lebanon, etc.
Okay, Norway, what kind of expressions of anti-Semitism have come about? First of all, how did you find yourself in Norway?
Well, I didn't mean to do it. I just followed my wife, who got a position at the university. She's a chemist.
Which university?
It was the University of Oslo, and today she's associated professor at the Oslo University College. And I came with her, so I could continue my studies from Israel. I'm a biologist, interested in insects, and somehow we managed to find ourselves there when Jew hatred began to explode.
And what was the trigger for that motivated such expressions of Jew hatred?
Jew hatred doesn't need to have motivation. It's there. And it just explodes whenever possible and whenever it's possible to accuse the Jews. For example, in 1982, the Lebanon War created, let's say, anti-Semitism in a huge wave, because people were concerned about Sabra and Shatila, were in fact Christian Arabs murdered Muslim Arabs, and we talk about some hundreds of people. But they didn't, the people with high moral and people who care about Arabs, they didn't care very much when Syria massacred between 7,000 to 20,000 Arabs in Hama. So it's not about Jews.
Well, but isn't it motivated by media reports, news reports about Israel?
Yes, sure. This is how it happens, and this is how it happened, and probably will continue to happen. People don't know a thing about Israel. They have no idea what's the difference between a Jew and an Arab. They don't know what language they speak. Of course, they can't recognize the writing, the handwriting, etc. But they know everything from the media. They know that what they heard about Israel from journalists and politicians in the media. It's about Israel.
Well, is it about Israel? Because if what they hear about Israel is true or false, what does that have to do with Norwegian citizens who happen to be of the Jewish worship faith?
I've been in Norway in 1994.
Since 94?
No, I've been since 92, but in 1994, during a short period, the massacre or the genocide in Rwanda took place. It was silent in Norway, not really a problem. It's only 800,000 people who died in such a terrible way. They didn't care. People didn't know much about it, and the media was quiet. When the media, when journalists bring to the consciousness of the people that terrible things happen, then people hear about it. And this is what's happening every day because of everything that is happening in Israel and can be shown in a negative way. It is shown. If it is positive, it will not be discussed at all.
Do you do anything with the journalists? You do any work with the journalists?
Yes, very much. We have a lot of conversation and dialogues with journalists, but very few times we succeeded to have good results. What we do more is to criticize, because journalists, when they criticize the Jews of Israel, and they criticize Jews, and not the stone and trees, they criticize a Jew in Israel, they do it in a way that they influence hundreds of thousands, and in fact millions of Norwegians. We speak about 4.5 million Norwegians. But when we have to correct the impression, we have to do it in the same way and to give the message to hundreds of thousands.
How is Israel responsible for the media impressions, or the way that the news reflects Israel's role in events? How is the media? How do Israel and the media work together to almost feed one another?
If you speak about, do you speak about how the Israeli government is working, or?
What does the government, or if there are NGOs or independent agencies?
It's only NGOs and the independent agencies or independent organizations that in fact work in the field. It's sad. It's I don't like to say it, but it is true. The Israeli embassy in Norway almost don't exist. They do many other functions, diplomatic functions, and some bureaucracy. But when it comes to explaining the Israeli position and why Jews have to come to Gaza, for example, to fight the Hamas terrorists, and why Arab children are being killed, the embassy is not there, and in Israel the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not doing its job in an appropriate way. They don't explain, and we have a lot to say.
And what forms of expression of anti-Semitism have happened?
It sounds weird, but short time after the media began to describe how terrible Israel, the government of Israel, they call it, behaves so badly and terribly and violently in Gaza, small children are harassed at school.
Jewish children?
Jewish children, yes. Some of them get Magen David, the Star of David, ripped from their neck. They are told a nasty thing. One of the bad words that Jewish children hear is Jew, Jode in Norwegian. In fact, I know also Christians who were called Jew or even Jew lover, and this is both children and adults. This is a part of it. Now, Jews are afraid to walk in the streets and showing that they are Jews. Most of the Jews in Norway will hide any sign of Judaism. If you find somebody going with a Star of David on their breast, you can trust they are Christians, not Jews. Jews are afraid. Jews are very cautious not to speak about their Jewishness. They think that nobody knows about it, which is false. Everybody knows who you are. But being afraid of walking in the street, being afraid of not getting promotion in your job. In some cases, even Jews went to a plastic operation just to correct the nose that is too Jewish and to be more Aryan, to be more European, more as everybody else. And of course, you don't speak about Israel, you don't speak about Judaism because you want to be like any other Norwegian. We have many other histories and examples,
but isn't Norway one of those Western, especially Northern European countries that's been traditionally anti-racist?
Racism is a part of Norway, and what they describe and how they describe themselves and advertise, in fact, Norway, this is something else. When you come to a Norwegian late history, in our times, racism is a part of society. I feel it, and my wife sometimes have to work to find a job to her ex-students because they are Muslims and they don't get jobs. They are not invited to a job interview. So my wife is trying to help them to find jobs.
How much of the trouble that the Jews are having in Norway is as a result of the Muslims?
Very little, to my opinion. I feel until lately, let's say until December 2008, I felt quite safe to walk in the Muslim part of Oslo, the Muslim-dominated part of Oslo. I will not do it now, but it is not because of the Muslims. It is because of the leftist, ethical Norwegians who are propagating hatred, who are in fact waging verbal war against the Jews of Israel, using all these humanitarian causes which are false, totally false. But without their organization, I don't believe we could see anti-Semitism in Norway. This is also describing the latest and maybe the first small intifada in Oslo during the end of 2008, beginning of 2009.
And what kind of things does your center do?
We write letters to, for example, the last letter to Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, complaining to the minister of what one of his employees did, comparing Jews to Nazis, and using the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a channel to do it. We have a lot of letters of complaints that we send to different officials. We give interviews in Norwegian media, write articles on papers. We have We have a quarterly magazine with 20,000 copies in Little Norway, which is quite nice. We have an email list and website.
What's the website?
Website is different. Is antisemitisme.no. Antisemitisme in Norwegian it's anti-Semitism, but with double T at the end and E at the end. It's mainly directed to Norwegians. Worldwide, we have some great organizations that do excellent work. But in Norway and Scandinavia generally, there is no much activity considering contemporary anti-Semitism.
Do you feel that there's a connection between the Muslims and the leftists?
Yes, there is a connection, but it is quite, I can say it's quite one-sided. It is Norwegian leftist extremists who are coming to the Muslims and organizing riots, organizing demonstrations, and in fact they propagate and even put into Muslim heads the idea that what the Jews of Israel do is terrible, it is illegal, it is violating Arab and Muslim rights. And when they give green light to Muslim in such a way, many Muslims with their education, with their limited knowledge of the situation, nobody of them have been in Israel, and nobody of them, almost nobody of them, no one of them met Jews, they just accept it as a true.
And they become resentful and angry towards the local Jewish population.
So in fact, we can even understand why they hate Jew, and some of the reaction are justified because of the information they got. Of course, we have to remember that many Germans in the 1930s and 1940s had justified reactions and hatreds of Jews because this is what they were fed.
I thought Norway is a fairly socialist country to begin with. Who would want to bring up even further leftist movement in Norwegian politics?
Your description is correct. Norway is a social democracy, and during the 2008-2009 there will be there is a government of Labour, socialist left-wing party, and another party, but it's basically social democratic. But this is also the people who all over Europe and many other places in the world, they spread anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism and anti-Israeli propaganda. That's the same people.
And what do you suppose is the future for Jews in Norway?
When we remember the historical experience, I can say that today Norway is not a violent place for Jews, even though it is much worse than it was a year ago. But if the Jews will not begin to speak out and to protest and to demand stop for the hate propaganda from Norwegian leaders of society, it will be worse. And when it will begin to be worse, I really don't like to think about it, but the experience of the 1930s and 40s says that escalation can begin and then we can't stop it. So we can stop it today, but we have to stop it.
Is there as much backlash against Muslims as an immigrant group, or as a racial group, or an ethnic group? Is there as much discrimination against Muslims as there is against Jews now?
No. Although there is racism in the society of Europe generally, and some of the hatred of Muslims is not justified, but Muslims are not demonized in the terrible way the Jews are. Jews are described by the leaders of society, by mainstream journalists and newspapers and television, and by church leaders as the worst thing. Or let's use the word of the president of the parliament, Torbjörn Jagland. He said something like that, and I quote, "If there is a threat against the world peace, it is the Israeli occupation." Now, the Israeli occupation, or everything else that is Israeli, of course we refer to Jews. So the Jews are a danger to the world's peace. Now, when you have such a terrible threat, of course it's natural to do something about it. And this is exactly the terrible and dangerous signs that the leaders give.
And how is Norway? How does Norway serve as a model for what's happening in the protests around the country as a result of Israeli self-defense? How's what's happening in these other cities around the world? Is that a precursor to the kind of animus that has taken place in Norway?
Let's remember that Norway is a very small country, and many people in other places don't really know what's going on in Norway, and many don't even know where Norway is. But so it is so that Norway don't influence much what other people are thinking. But Norway used the Swedish-financed Nobel Peace Prize to give it to two Arabs, Muslim Arabs, who were very keen to destroy Israel. The first of them is Anwar Sadat, that came to Jerusalem with a swastika on his tie. And we have nice photograph with both Begin and Moshe Dayan and others. He came to Jerusalem, and in the evening, when he came to dinner with all the cameras, he came with a swastika on his tie. Now, it's not just by chance, because Sadat admired Hitler, and he even wrote about it. And he was a German spy during the war. And this is the first of them. The other one is Yasser Arafat, and it is perhaps time to remember that he is responsible for killing of so many Jews. So that's the two Arabs who got Nobel Peace Prize from Norway. And today, when there is hatred and there is escalation in violence between Israel and Arabs of Eretz Israel, the only voices in Norway say that they want to take back the Peace Prize from Shimon Peres, but not from Yasser Arafat. You can do it. For a dead person or for a person that already got the prize. But this is we speak about the voices. It's negative toward the Jews of Israel, no matter what. And of course, there is a tendency and there is a wish that Israel will cease to be a Jewish state.
There's the will, the desire?
Yes. In 1971, the youth movement of the Labour Party decided, and they have a resolution that they will work to support PLO and to seize the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. The young people of this time, the leader of the youth movement at this time was a foreign minister that was very active in the Oslo process, and this is the line. It's not something special. It's acceptable idea.
Do you get any help from any other countries in terms of criticizing Norway's anti-Israelism?
Yes, we got important help from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. They were very early to understand how difficult the situation is, and we had also a period that they tried to ignore, that Norwegian leaders tried to ignore criticism from us, and then we needed the big brother that the Wiesenthal Center is, and right now they speak loudly sometime, once in a while, and it helps very much. We got also help from the ADL, and we got also help from Israel, from the